Hey again, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are talking about campaigns and elections, which, if you might imagine, is a very important topic in this particular semester, this particular course of study. Today we're going to be thinking about, I think, a key takeaway that we shouldn't forget when we're talking about America's electoral institutions. And that is this idea that the way that Americans conduct elections is one possibility out of a large number of different possibilities. And if we look across the world at various democracies that conduct elections on a regular basis in what Dahl might call polyarchies or relatively free and fair countries, we can see that there are all kinds of different trade-offs potentially associated with these various electoral rules. So they have different features and different limitations. So again, as you're studying these electoral institutions, I think it's important to keep in mind not only this question of where did these come from and what is the historical basis for why we have these rules, but also how could differences or changes to these rules produce different outcomes. Political science for a very long time has distinguished sort of two subfields within its study, at least in American politics. And we often think about scholars who study political behavior as being on one side of the discipline. That would include people like me. And then scholars who study political institutions on the other side of the discipline, people who study some of these core institutional designs, like what we're talking about today, like the presidency, like Congress, all these different institutional sort of arrangements in a democracy. And really, I think that this topic in particular brings us into a collision course between these two sort of branches or subsets of the field, where we're really now thinking about the behavioral implications of these institutions. How does this change the way that average Americans engage in political behavior? How does it change the way in which they think about and react to the political world? And so the first thing I'd like you to do in this module is I'm going to actually get you to consider a little exercise. Obviously, we don't have time to do this exercise in groups in our regular meeting because of the fact that the midterm exam is happening this week. But when we think about these electoral institutions, we can begin before the exercise by thinking about what we do in the United States. And that is to say that in the United States, as the framers of the Constitution were putting together these institutions, they didn't have a tremendous number of sort of templates to work from in terms of functioning sort of democracies with voting, right? They created essentially majoritarian institutions in which essentially whoever has the most of whatever, be it votes in Congress or votes for an elected office, is the winner. Of course, some of these harken back to sort of British colonial majoritarian institutions that had been established at the time. But at the end of the day, what this boils down to is a commitment in America to a specific kind of electoral rule called single member or first past the post electoral rules, also known as plurality rules. And these are essentially the simplest possible rules where, again, whichever candidate gets the most votes wins sort of all of the seats, or in this case, just the single seat that is up for grabs. So basically we have elections where there's a single seat being contested, you have candidates running for them, and whoever gets the most votes is the winner. That might sound like an incredibly obvious thing to you, right? That seems like the way that an election should work. Whoever gets the most votes wins. But as it turns out, there are a variety of different alternatives that we could consider that substantially change some of the sort of facets of the electoral process. And so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to introduce this worksheet to you, and you can play along at home after the end of this video. And I'd like you to, again, think about this just by putting this into practice. We're going to compare some of these different voting systems. We're going to allocate seats to votes. And as we'll see in a moment, I think this is going to uncover some very important principles about how our electoral system works and what the potential drawbacks and advantages are of this particular SMD FPTP system that we have in the United States. Okay, so here we have the worksheet that I was talking about. And in the first part of this worksheet, we can consider three fictional parties who are running in a country, kind of maybe like Genovia, that has 5 districts. Okay, so these districts are extraordinarily rectangular. We can see here, if we put this country all together, this is like a blown out, sort of fractured, splintered version of this country. It's really just a big rectangle. We can see that there's a sort of a leftmost district, a middle district, there's districts on the right, and there's finally this rightmost district. And each square here corresponds to an individual voter, essentially. Let's imagine that this little fictional country, everybody who lives in the country gets these little lots where they live, right? So this is not a very large country. Everybody lives in a little plot of land that's exactly the same size. And we've got these three parties. We've got the We Love Cats party, the We Love Dogs party. Oh, Ellie, the cat, wants to vote for the We Love Cats party. She's here yelling into the microphone. We've got those two parties, and then we finally have a third party called the We Love Guinea Pigs party. And so we can see that across all these districts, again, if we were to put this whole thing together, we would see that there are, overall, we can count the number of little plots of land where these people live. There are 24 cat supporters, 24 people who like cats, 26 dog supporters, right? So there's, again, if you go through this and you systematically count up all these squares, I'm not kidding, it's exactly 24 cat supporters, exactly 26 dog supporters, and 10 guinea pig supporters. Okay, so the guinea pig supporters, only about 17% of the population is a guinea pig supporter, compared to 43% dog supporters and 40% cat supporters. So there's no, it's important to think about this, there's no majority opinion in this little country. Essentially, it's divided into support for sort of three different groups or animals, that is. And so the first thing that I'd like you to do is go through this sheet and think about what might happen if we were to assign the winners of each of these 5 districts on the basis of the rules that we have in the United States today. That is the plurality, single-member district, first past the post system that we have today. And so again, as I said in just a moment ago, this is an extraordinarily simple calculation. Right? When we think about this, you simply are going to go through each of these districts and you're going to try to figure out which party has the most votes in each district. Right? So if we think about District 1, I'll just give you a hint. You can do this on your own. But in District 1, we have 4 cat votes, we have 3 guinea pig votes, and we have 5 dog votes. And so essentially in this election, if it were to be run today, the dog party would win by a vote of 5 to 4 to 3. So essentially, again, first past the post means whoever gets the most votes wins that whole district. So congratulations, whoever is running in this district for the dog party, they're going to be the winners of that district. So you can go ahead and you can calculate in each case, you can count up these squares and figure out which of the parties is going to win representation. And so the question I have for you as you complete that part of the exercise is to think whether the composition of Congress, that this 5-person Congress that's going to result, is this proportional to the overall proportion of supporters in the population? So by that I mean, the cat party has 40% of the support in the country. 43% of the support goes to the dogs, and 17% goes to the guinea pigs. What percentage of the seats now belong to the dog party? What percentage of the seats belong to the cat party? And what percentage of the seats belong to the guinea pig party? And so when you think about that proportionality, what I mean is there a fit between the percentage of the population that really prefers one party and the number of seats, or the percent of the seats out of 100% that belong to that party? And if that proportionality is disproportional, if there's not a lot of proportionality, we can ask ourselves the question of why that is. What's going on in these districts that might create disproportionality? Thinking back maybe to some of our exercises with gerrymandering. The second set of rules that we should consider are majority runoff rules. And so this is a slightly different set of rules, right? Again, this is not what we have in the United States to a large extent. Most of our elections are run using just SMD rules like we had in example number 1. In example number 2, we have a slightly different setup where under the majority runoff rules, you need to get a majority, or in this case, we're just going to say 50%, which again is not really a majority, but 50% plus 0.00001, let's imagine. If you get 50% of the black square, or the black, white, or gray squares in your specific district, then there is no runoff. Essentially, if you get up to that 50% threshold, then you win the election outright. Okay, but if no party is able to get up to 50%, if the number of squares is essentially in each case less than 6. Right, let's look at this. District 2 is a good example, right? So in this case, the black party, the cat party here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, has achieved 50% of the 12 plots in the district. And so we would say that they win outright and there's no need for a runoff. However, if we look at, for example, district number 3 here, the dog party seems to be winning here. They've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 4 to 3, as we saw in some of the other districts. However, did they get 6 out of 12? Did they get 50%? They did not. They would need to have flipped this household from gray to white. And as a result, we need to do something to allocate this vote. It's no longer the case that just the dog party wins outright. What we need to do now is we need to rerun the election in order to verify a majority winner. So essentially this election is conducted in 2 stages. This is similar in some respects to the French presidential election system, in which there's a second round, essentially, of the top 2 vote getters. And so in these districts where there's no 50% winner, essentially, then we have to then run the election again. And what generally happens, just give you a hint, is that the guinea pigs, being this small minority party, they are generally going to get eliminated from all of these runoff elections, because the top 2 vote getters are going to be the ones that go on to the next round. And so what happens is these guinea pigs, the guinea pig party, that we need to start asking the question of what actually happens in terms of the preferences of the guinea pigs. Do they prefer one party over the other if given a choice between just cats and dogs, and the guinea pigs are out of the picture? So again, what this does is this essentially says that the guinea pigs, even though they're this small percentage of the population, the guinea pig lovers, is that they get now a chance to have their voice heard in a more meaningful way, because they get to contribute to the outcome between the two big boys, the 2 big parties, right? And so essentially in each round, you can fill in this blank, right? Either the district gets to 50% of a vote, or of the vote going to one party, and you can just write in a winner. Or if there's no 50% vote getter, you can write runoff into this box, and then you can proceed down to round 2, and you can determine if all the guinea pig votes go, I'm going to say here, guinea pigs are going to vote for the cats. This is actually a typo. Guinea pigs are always going to vote for the cats. Okay, so I guess they prefer to vote for the animal that's closer in size to the guinea pigs. Let's just use that rule. Okay, so if gray gets eliminated, all the guinea pig votes go towards the cat. And so what I want you to do is to consider comparing across the SMD and this majority runoff rules, and see who gets now the most representation under these different rules. Now, finally, is the proportional representation part of this, which is, I think, the most complicated and something that is probably the most foreign to people who are used to, again, the very simple kind of single-member district first past the post voting rules that we have in the United States. In this case, what we end up doing is we end up getting rid of all of the districts. And so if you remember like the gerrymandering that exists in in the House of Representatives in the United States, what we would do is we'd essentially take all those district lines and we would erase them. So essentially within entire states, for example, we could have a system in which people are voting not for individual candidates, but for whole lists of candidates. So essentially you get a party vote. And in most PR systems, what ends up happening is the parties will rank candidates in order of importance. And so we can see here that we've got basically the party rank. These parties have done it essentially in terms of who's most important to the organization. And we've got these individuals here who are candidates, individual candidates running for the cat party, the dog party, and the guinea pig party. And so they create what's called a list, essentially with the most important candidates at the top and the least important candidates at the bottom. So Marcella McMeow, Ruffin Barkley, and Samantha Squeak are essentially the most important candidates for each of these 3 elections. And then down here, we've got some people who have maybe not spent a lot of time in the senior member, people who don't hold important positions in the party, like Lily Litterbox, Rex Ryan, and Patricia Pellet, down here at the bottom of the list. And so the order of this list is actually going to be important for determining which of these individual people actually end up getting to serve in this little congressional system that we have in this fictional country. And so the way that this works, essentially, is all of the voters in the country, again, remember the 24, the 26, and the 10 voters, are all going to cast their votes for their preferred party. So the cat party voters are going to vote, 24 of them are going to vote for this party represented by the black squares, 26 are going to vote for the dogs, and then the guinea pigs are also going to vote for the gray. So we're not going to eliminate the guinea pigs here. We're going to include their votes for this third party in the election. And so what happens is this proportional method, as I've written here, assigns candidates in this list to seats. And so what I'd like to do is think about how we might assign these seats based on the number of votes achieved by the candidates. And so essentially we could imagine that each vote is like $1, right? And we've got the cat party voters have $24, the dog party voters have $26, that is votes, and the guinea pig party has 10 votes. However, in order to place one of these individuals from the top of the list into Congress, in order to get one of these people into the seats, right, you have to spend essentially 12 of these vote dollars in order to get a seat. And so the cat party might go up and say, hey, look, we've got 24 vote dollars, right? So that means that since each seat costs 12 votes, we can spend all 24 of them on 2 whole seats. And so what do? We go up to the cat party list. Marcella McMeow and Priscilla Purr, congratulations, you are in Congress. So seat 1 and seat 2 go to the cat party list. Now we go to the dog party. The dog party has 26 votes, or dollar vote here things here, and they're going to attempt to purchase seats as well. So they're going to say, we've got 26, let's buy 1. So Ruff and Barkley goes into seat 3. We can buy a second one. Bella Boneberry goes into seat 4, and then we have 2 left over. Now, can somebody buy a seat with $2? Well, I would ask you the same thing, right? If a pizza at a fast food restaurant costs $12 and you have $6, can you go up to the counter and say, hey, can I get half a pizza? Can you cut me a deal? Maybe. I don't think that's necessarily going to work in many cases. They'll say, no, we have this menu item and you can either buy it for full price or you can get out, right? So this is the exact same thing where there's a remainder. Essentially, there's 2 votes left over, but that's not enough to accumulate the 12 votes required to place a third person in the seat. And so what happens is we have to go to a remainder allocation system. Now, this is complicated. I don't think that we need to, for these purposes, spend too much time looking at it. But essentially, you can use this simple kind of method. This is actually a method that's called the DeHaan method, or also the Jefferson's method, because Thomas Jefferson was somebody who thought a little bit about this remainders rules as well in some of his writing. Essentially, at the end of the day, we need to allocate this last seat. And what it comes down to is whichever party has the most remaining votes after all of the other seats have been allocated. And so at the end of the day, what it comes down to is the dog party has 2 votes left. The guinea pig party, though, has never had a seat yet, and they have 10 votes left. They don't have enough to get that full seat, but they have 10. And so if we do this math, you'll end up seeing that the guinea pig party essentially is the most deserving of a seat. And so the 5th seat, even though they're not able to get all the way up to a full credit for a vote, they have the highest remainder, and they end up getting seat number 5. And so for the first time, in comparison of all 3 of these different rules, Samantha Squeak is now finally seated in Congress and gets to occupy seat number 5. And so this is something to really think about, right? Which rules are best if you're the cats? Which rules are the best if you're the guinea pigs? Which rules are the best if you're the dogs? And why? And how do you feel about these different rules, right? How proportional, perhaps, are some of these different rules? So again, if this is very foreign to you, this is very confusing, take a close look at this description, and let me know certainly if you have any questions. All right, so I hope you enjoyed taking a look at this seats to vote exercise. And really, I think in debriefing this exercise and getting you to think again, really one of the things I want to focus on is this question of under which system did the guinea pigs get the best representation? This is kind of this third party, you might say, or a party for which there are far fewer committed voters than others. And certainly you can imagine where I'm going with this, given that in the United States we have 2 major parties that have essentially the vast majority of the party identifiers in our electoral context. And then we also have a series of very small third parties like the Green Party and the Libertarian Party. You may even see some of these candidates on your ballots as you go to vote in the 2020 presidential election. As you go to vote, you might see these candidates, and you might be wondering, who are these people? What is this third party? And really, I think the thing to think about in the context of American politics right now is that when we compare this to many European democracies and many other democracies around the world that use these other political systems, we can see that these systems are much friendlier to third parties, parties that are not like the top 2 parties. Essentially, if we were to apply these systems to our congressional elections, the House and the Senate might look very different, right? And again, really, this is a normative question. This is a question for you to consider: is whether you think that those different visions are more preferable to what we have now, comparatively. Do we think that having electoral rules like proportional representation, which afford a much greater opportunity for third parties to have some seats in Congress, is that a good idea or is it not? And so one wrinkle to really think about is this idea that in many multi-party systems, right, this a system essentially where the voting rules afford the ability of third parties to be more viable and more competitive, we often have, at the end of the day, after votes are counted and after seats are allocated, another step to consider, which makes things a little bit more complicated. And that is this idea that if no single party achieves a majority in Congress, then they're going to be unable to pass legislation. And so what needs to happen is those parties are going to need to team up with another small party in order to get over that 50% threshold. And of course, in many cases, that also will mean that they'll be able to appoint a prime minister who's going to serve in sort of this quasi-executive function. We have a different system because we have, again, these checks and balances and an executive that is separate from Congress. But in many PR systems, that's also a feature where the prime minister is actually somebody who comes from the Congress and is not elected separately. So if we think about this need for coalition building, this need to create a unit that's going to be a majority in Congress out of a potential set of numerous smaller parties, if we go back to our fictional country, we can think about proportional representation and the fact that Samantha Squeak was this guinea pig party lover who managed to finally get that 5th seat in Congress. And so Samantha Squeak in this case actually has a really important decision to make as an individual. Because the individuals in the cat party, right, Henrietta Hiss or whoever it was, that teamed up, or they have 2 cat lovers in Congress. There's also 2 dog lovers in Congress. But that 5th seat is going to be the pivotal seat to determine who's going to be able to essentially cast a majority of the votes for any legislation. And so, again, anybody who's trying to cast totally dog-friendly legislation or totally cat-friendly legislation is only going to get 2/5 of the way to a majority vote. They're not going to be able to get a majority in Congress. So these 2 parties are going to need to get Samantha Squeak to agree with them to pass legislation that's favorable. And so Samantha Squeak can choose to join the cats in a ruling coalition or the dogs in a ruling coalition. She has the choice of actually being sort of the kingmaker in Congress, determining which party gets the majority. Otherwise, neither party is going to be able to pass any legislation. And so Samantha Squeak might say, hey, give me some concessions, right? Make sure that there's little guinea pig, carrot snacks all, in public accommodations, right? Make things more accessible to people who love guinea pigs. But we could imagine that if the dogs were able to convince the guinea pigs to join up with them to create legislation, this coalition would actually be quite different than a dog only majority, right? Because we're going to start to see a whole bunch of guinea pig favorable legislation in Congress that otherwise wouldn't have existed at all. Because again, under, for example, first past the post rules, the guinea pigs would have been completely shut out of Congress. There would have been absolutely no need to make concessions to them because they would have no congressional representation. Similar to essentially the U.S. case, where the vast majority of both senators and representatives belong to both the Republican and the Democratic parties. So, I mean, we can think about this, right? Many coalitions across the world in terms of PR systems end up having these multi-party coalitions. Like, for example, if in the U.S. we could have these really interesting sort of setups. Imagine if we had electoral rules that meant that Greens were able to win more often than they are now. We could have, we might call this the Christmas coalition, because often these things are nicknamed based on sort of the colors that represent the different parties. So Republicans generally are represented in electoral map and things by the color red. Greens obviously are shown in green. So this would be a red-green coalition. I don't know what kind of policy a Christmas coalition would produce in the United States. It would be a very strange setup indeed, generally because the Greens tend to run to the left of Democrats on a lot of pivotal issues. This might be a more likely coalition here. I call this the Seattle Seahawks coalition because it's blue and green, right? If you've seen the uniforms of the Seattle Seahawks football team. We could have blue representing the Democrats and then greens represented by green. We could also have, maybe this would be also a potentially viable coalition, if there were a number of libertarian candidates that were to win seats in the House of Representatives. We could have, for example, Democrats and libertarians maybe trying to pass legislation that would, again, increase sort of the liberal nature of social policy. However, I could imagine that this coalition would be extraordinarily upset at each other and extraordinarily unlikely to come to any agreements about economic policy, given that Democrats and libertarians generally do not see eye to eye on things like the size of social programs. And then finally, we've got a coalition that I could imagine being quite viable in the U.S. is the Hot Dog Hold the Relish coalition, right? A Republican, libertarian combination where libertarians would probably be pushing Republicans to the right on economic issues and to the left on social issues. So again, very, very interesting kind of things to think about. And really, I think the key takeaway of this entire exercise, this entire discussion, is to think about the fact that essentially we arrive in this case at essentially a phenomenon called Duverger's law. Okay, and Duverger's law, I'm going to come back to this stuff, but Duverger's law essentially states that plurality single-member district rules almost always result in two-party systems because small third parties virtually never get enough votes to actually matter. And again, that's because in every specific district, you need to get the most votes in order to get any representation, which means that in a contest that's got a Democrat, a Republican, and a Libertarian, or a Democrat, a Republican, and a Green in any district, unless for whatever bizarre reason there's a gigantic geographical concentration of Greens or a gigantic geographical concentration of Libertarians in this one area, which pretty much never happens, you're unlikely to get up to the level of the Democrats and the Republicans in any specific election. And so as a result, it's often strategic for somebody who even might consider themselves to be libertarian or somebody to identify as somebody who likes the Green Party agenda to drop their third party label and assimilate into these two parties. In America, we have essentially big tent parties, which means that if we were to have these other electoral rules, you could imagine that we'd end up having a whole bunch of smaller parties that represent the different sort of wings of these parties that we currently have. However, in the US right now, what we have is big parties that essentially cram in a whole bunch of different groups with a whole bunch of different specific issues, specific kinds of priorities, and we essentially duke out our elections on the basis of those two specific party labels. So again, just returning to this seats to votes debrief, we could think about this question of how might this U.S. system look, right? I mean, we could even imagine that in the case of a multi-party U.S. system, other parties that we have never even thought about yet might even emerge, right? New parties that have maybe specific issues as their kind of motivating drive, right? Issues that are important on the political agenda, but neither specific American party is particularly interested in. And again, really the question is to think about, would this be advantageous? Would this be problematic for our politics, for the way that this actually works in the United States, especially in an era with intense polarization. And again, I think a lot of people who are rightly feeling like the two parties in American politics are sort of not serving their particular political interests. And so again, right, I just want to, before I end this portion of our discussion, is just really to, again, think about the idea that it might seem very alluring to think about reallocating seats in a different way to produce a multi-party system in the United States. But we also have to think about the next steps, which is the capacity to govern of any ruling coalition of potentially smaller parties that have to join forces, like some kind of Megatron, Voltron thing, combine forces to create sort of a large enough coalition to actually pass legislation. But on the other hand, again, really thinking about the pros and cons of the I can't even talk today, the plurality rules that we have in the United States, right? We do produce single-party legislative control pretty much always in American politics because it's fairly easy. As long as you have the most seats in Congress, you're going to pretty much always have 50% plus one because there's only two parties. Right? But again, third parties, if you care about these parties, if you're somebody who believes in the issue agendas of these specific parties, then it means that you don't get your voice heard the same way because those third parties under these rules pretty much always lose. And so again, as you're thinking about your own votes in 2020, think about this idea of what it means to be a strategic voter. And think about the fact that third parties in the United States are essentially set up to fail, specifically because of the electoral rules, the SMD, first past the post rules that we have in the United States. So I leave you to think about Duverger's law again, ponder this idea that SMD rules always result in two-party systems and not much else. And again, as you're thinking about your own vote choices, think hard about how it is that our electoral rules shape some of the strategy that you yourself will be employing as you go to the ballot box this year. Have a great one. I'll see you guys next time.